So summarizing then, we have that you get the genetic information from your dad and from your mom, and this genetic information is going to be provided to you in your DNA. The DNA contains all the genes that are going to make you. So then, how do we create proteins from this DNA? The first step is going to be transcription. You can skip this part. This is basically for microbiology. So the first step is transcription. From transcription, the next step is translation. So what is transcription? Is getting information from the DNA and creating RNA. What is translation? Is getting the RNA and from the RNA creating proteins. So let's start over again then. We have the DNA. That's the genetic information your dad and your mom are going to give you. So how do you create RNA from DNA? By a process called transcription. Once you create the RNA, another process called translation is going to give you your proteins. And that's what you need to know for this part. So right here you have translation again with all the different steps that are necessary in order to create the proteins. So, and then here's a sequence of pictures showing you how this happens. Obviously, it's much better to see a video, so I'm going to show you a video about it. So once the proteins are created, they need to be processed, right? And they need to be secreted. Again, they need to be processed in order to be created and transformed into something that is going to be useful for the body. And remember, we were talking about that. We were saying that proteins have multiple different functions, such as enzyme, channels, second messengers, cell identity markers, cell addition proteins. So all these things are the different types of processing that these proteins need to have in order to be able to work the way they are supposed to be. So if you scroll down, the next item that we're going to have, for example, you have an example in here of how a protein is assembled in order to be used, for example, as part of your cell membrane. Okay, so again, these are just steps on how you create different types of proteins. Also, the proteins are not created every single minute, right? There's different steps that are going to happen, and these proteins are going to be created according to the body needs. So it's not that it's created every 24 hours, because obviously you don't need that. For example, when females are pregnant and then they have the baby, they need to produce breast milk, right? And then at that moment, for example, the mom needs to produce milk for the first time. So then how come your body is able to produce milk? Because again, proteins for that specific moment are going to be created, and that's already codified in your genetic information. Okay, so then you scroll down and you have more information as to how the proteins are going to be used, right? And then right here you have a nice table about it. Okay, again, functions of newly synthesized proteins. Okay, but again, we already talked about that. There's another example in here, sodium potassium pump. I already mentioned that that's very important because sodium potassium pump is a protein, right? So you have to be clear about that. The proteins are very important. Synthesizing of other compounds other than proteins, yes, it's true. We produce other things, not just proteins, but every single thing that is produced in your body is produced because there is an enzyme or there is a channel that is a protein that is going to make the production of something else, such as, for example, glycogen or fat possible. So how come we are able to create fat, for example, to store in our love handles? Well, because there are enzymes that are proteins that are going to make that possible. So again, even though there are many things that are going to be created in your body other than proteins, these things are created just because there are actually proteins that are going to be enzymes making this creation possible. The next item that we have in this chapter is DNA replication and the cell cycle. This cell cycle is basically to show you that there are two main things that the cell are going to do. As I mentioned this before, I said the cell either is doing its regular job, whatever it needs to do every single day, and when the cell actually needs to duplicate, meaning it needs to create another one. Okay, so let's take a look at the cell cycle so you guys can understand this part. First part right here, it shows DNA replication. Why? Because, for example, if you have one cell, you have the DNA, right? But what happens if you need to create actually two cells, right? Which is the cell division. then if you have one DNA in one cell, if you need to create two cells, then you need to actually have two sets of DNA. So therefore, there is a need to create another set of DNA so one cell can get one set of DNA and the other cell can get another cell of DNA. So then what is that? That is DNA replication. What is replication? The creation of DNA from DNA. In what circumstances? For example, when you have to create another cell. One cell divides and gives you two cells, right? And that process is called DNA replication. Obviously, there's a set of steps that are necessary in order to create DNA from DNA, and that those steps are the ones that you have right here. Obviously, the most important part that you need to know is that there is an enzyme called DNA polymerase. The DNA polymerase is the one that is going to make the creation of another DNA possible. There's multiple steps, but this goes beyond the purpose of this anatomy class. This is biology and genetics, which is something that you should know before you are taking this class. So DNA is going to be copied, and the copy of DNA is called replication. So let's scroll down so you can see some important information. Errors and mutations, we're going to talk about it in a little bit. I want to go directly to the cell cycle. Right here is the cell cycle. Okay. And the cell cycle has two pieces, two parts, the green one and the brown one. So basically, the green one right here is what the cell does every single day. That's its job, right? Whatever the job of the cell is. And the brown one is when the cell needs to divide in order to create two cells. You see, here you have one cell, and then eventually it creates two cells. This cell has a nucleus with DNA. At the end, you have to have two cells, and each cell needs to have DNA. So what is the process of creating DNA and creating two sets of DNA? Replication. So let's take a look at this part in green. That part in green is called interphase. This part, interphase, has three different phases. G1 is when the cell is doing everything again that the cell needs to do every single day. Eventually, the cell is going to say, okay, I need to divide. So the first part, when the cell is doing every single day activities, is called G1. When the cell says eventually I need to divide, the cell will go into the S phase. The S phase is the duplication of the DNA, which is again DNA replication. Okay, now you have two sets of DNA. Now imagine again that this cell has one mitochondria. Okay, if you're going to create two mitochondria, then you need to create another mitochondria. Why? Because this will get one mitochondria and this will get mitochondria. Imagine that this cell has 5 liters of cytoplasm. So then the cell must create another 5 liters so this cell can get 5 liters of cytoplasm and 5 liters of cytoplasm. So basically you need to duplicate everything. So the duplication of everything else in your body other than the DNA, because the DNA was created already right here in the S phase, the duplication of everything falls under the phase called G2. So then you already duplicated the DNA, you already duplicated everything else. So then now you go to this part, the brown part, which is called the mitotic phase, in which the cell is ready to duplicate, to create two other cells. Why? Because the cell is already with two sets of everything. So one set can go at the end to one cell and the other set can go to the other cell. The cell division, the mitotic phase, has multiple steps. They are called phases. The first one is prophase, then you have metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and cytokinesis. After you have the two cells, then this cell will go again into interphase and this other cell will go into interphase again. So they are going to start on their own with their own green part. So I hope that this part is clear. So now we can take a look at how the mitotic phase or mitosis actually happens. Okay, if we scroll down, right here we have mitosis again. So mitosis is the creation of two cells from one cell. So what is mitosis? The creation of two cells. You have in here the different steps. These are the steps that you need to know in case that I ask you questions about it. Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. And this is how they look. Right here, this brown, this dark area is the chromosome. Right here, the chromosomes separate, and right here you have the two cells with the chromosomes in there. So now let's go back to errors and mutations. So when you're copying the DNA, by the process called replication. Sometimes the DNA the copying of this DNA is done with mistakes, with errors. So remember we said that the A always is with T and the C is always with G. So imagine sometimes they put A with G instead of A with T. So that's a mutation. Sometimes these mutations can be fixed, sometimes cannot be fixed. A lot of times when these mutations cannot be fixed, that cell turns into cancer. So that's all basically what you need to know about it. The next topic is chromosomes and heredity. Again, we said that we get 46 chromosomes from our parents, and that's what you're gonna get half from your mom, half from your dad. We said 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs, right? When you put together all of them, that's a karyotype. Kind of like this is a picture of all your chromosomes. What's a karyotype? The picture of all your chromosomes, the 46 chromosomes that you have. So right here is a picture of all your chromosomes in pairs, okay? And this is what your karyotype is. You have half of it from your mom, half of it from your dad, right? Okay, so then you have these chromosomes that are going to provide you all the information, and all the information is located in genes. Now, so let's say your mom has curly hair and your dad has straight hair. The location of this gene for hair is called locus. Now, since you got two types of information, straight hair and curly hair, those are going to be alleles. Those are two different kinds of genes for the same information. So since you have two different ones, those are going to be called alleles, straight and curly. So imagine that you got straight hair, and all your brothers and your sisters, everybody gets straight hair, even though your mom has curly hair. So that means that straight hair is dominant and curly hair is recessive. This basically is the laws of Mendel, which he studied this with peas, green and yellow, and this is the basic of what biology actually teaches and genetics. So again, I'm not going to talk about it because this is basically genetics and you should know this already. So if we keep scrolling down, we have in here that you can have identical alleles. So for example, we said that if you have straight hair and curly hair, so those are not identical alleles, therefore that's heterozygous. But imagine that you have straight hair from your dad and straight hair from your dad, then that's homozygous. Okay, so then you show straight hair, that is your phenotype, that's the one you show. But in your genes inside of you have curly and straight, that is your genotype. So what your mom and your dad give you, that's genotype, but the one that you show that everybody can see, that's the phenotype. Okay, again, this is genetics, that's just general information about this. Okay, there's obviously other different ways to explain the genetics that are going to happen, and that's multiple alleles, codominance, incomplete dominance. I'm not going to talk about that because that's genetics. That's something that you are supposed to know already. So I'm not going to talk about that. You have more about it. You can skip all this because this is not going to be part of your exam, because again, this is not anatomy and physiology. So environmental effects, no, dominant recessive, I already explained that, even though I'm not supposed to do that, but that's basically everything about this chapter. This is just genetics, and that's not a topic of this class.